How Love Came to Professor Guildea by Robert Hichens. Dull people often wondered how it came about that Father Murchison and Professor Frederick Guildea were intimate friends. The one was all faith, the other all skepticism. The nature of the father was based on love. He viewed the world with an almost childlike tenderness above his long black cassock, and his mild, yet perfectly fearless blue eyes seemed always to be watching the goodness that exists in humanity, and rejoicing at what they saw. The professor, on the other hand, had a hard face like a hatchet, tipped with an aggressive black goatee beard. His eyes were quick, piercing, and irreverent. The lines about his small, thin-lipped mouth were almost cruel. His voice was harsh and dry. Sometimes, when he grew energetic, almost soprano, it fired off words with a sharp and clipping utterance. His habitual manner was one of distrust and investigation. It was impossible to suppose that in his busy life he found any time for love, either of humanity in general or of an individual. Yet his days were spent in scientific investigations which conferred immense benefits upon the world. Both men were celibates. Father Murchison was a member of an Anglican order which forbade him to marry. Professor Guildea had a poor opinion of most things, but especially of women. He had formerly held a post as lecturer at Birmingham, but when his fame as a discoverer grew, he removed to London. There, at a lecture he gave in the East End, he first met Father Murchison. They spoke a few words. Perhaps the bright intelligence of the priest appealed to the man of science, who was inclined as a rule to regard the clergy with some contempt. Perhaps the transparent sincerity of this devotee, full of common sense, attracted him. As he was leaving the hall, he abruptly asked the father to call on him at his house in Hyde Park Place, and the father, who seldom went into the West End except to preach, accepted the invitation. "When will you come?" said Guildea. He was folding up the blue paper on which his notes were written, in a tiny, clear hand. The leaves rustled dryly in accompaniment to his sharp, dry voice. "On Sunday week I am preaching in the evening at St. Saviour's, not far off," said the father. "I don't go to church." "No," said the father, without any accent of surprise or condemnation. "Come to supper afterwards?" "Thank you, I will." "What time will you come?" The father smiled. "As soon as I have finished my sermon. The service is at 6:30. "About 8 then, I suppose. Don't make the sermon too long. My number in Hyde Park Place is 100. Good night to you." He snapped an elastic band round his papers and strode off without shaking hands. On the appointed Sunday, Father Murchison preached to a densely crowded congregation at St. Saviour's. The subject of his sermon was sympathy, and the comparative uselessness of man in the world, unless he can learn to love his neighbour as himself. The sermon was rather long, and when the preacher, in his flowing black cloak, and his hard round hat, with a straight brim over which hung the ends of a black cord, made his way towards the professor's house, the hands of the illuminated clock disc at the marble arch pointed to 20 minutes past 8. The father hurried on, pushing his way through the crowd of standing soldiers, chattering women, and giggling street boys in their Sunday best. It was a warm April night, and when he reached number 100 Hyde Park Place, he found the professor bareheaded on his doorstep, gazing out towards the park railings, and enjoying the soft, moist air in front of his lighted passage. "Ah, a long sermon," he exclaimed. "Come in." "I fear it was," said the father, obeying the invitation. "I am that dangerous thing, an extempore preacher. More attractive to speak without notes if you can do it. Hang your hat and coat, cloak, here. We'll have supper at once. This is the dining room." He opened a door on the right, and they entered a long, narrow room, with a gold paper and a black ceiling. from which hung an electric lamp with a gold-coloured shade. In the room stood a small oval table with covers laid for two. The professor rang the bell. Then he said, "People seem to talk better at an oval table than at a square one." "Really? Is that so?" "Well, I've had precisely the same party twice. Once at a square table, once at an oval table. The first dinner was a dull failure, the second a brilliant success. Sit down, won't you?" "How do you account for the difference?" said the father, sitting down and pulling the tail of his cassock well under him. I know how you'd account for it." "Indeed? How then?" "At an oval table, since there are no corners, the chain of human sympathy, the electric current, is much more complete. Let me give you some soup?" "Thank you." The father took it, and as he did so, turned his beaming blue eyes on his host. Then he smiled. "What?" he said, in his pleasant, light tenor voice. "You do go to church sometimes, then?" "Tonight is the first time for ages. And, mind you, I was tremendously bored." The father still smiled, and his blue eyes gently twinkled. "Dear, dear," he said. "What a pity." "But not by the sermon," Guildea added. "I don't pay a compliment. I state a fact. The sermon didn't bore me. If it had, I should have said so, or said nothing." "And which would you have done?" The professor smiled, almost genially. "Don't know," he said. "What wine do you drink?" "Oh, none, thank you. I'm a teetotaler. In my profession and milieu, it is necessary to be one. Yes, I will have some soda water." "I think you would have done the first." "Very likely, and very wrongly. You wouldn't have minded much." "I don't think I should." They were intimate already. The father felt most pleasantly at home under the black ceiling. He drank some soda water, and seemed to enjoy it more than the professor enjoyed his claret. "You smile at the theory of the chain of human sympathy, I see," said the father. "Then what is your explanation of the failure of your square party with corners, the success of your oval party without them?" "Probably on the first occasion the wit of the assembly had a chill on his liver, while on the second he was in perfect health. Yet you see I stick to the oval table." "And that means?" "Very little. By the way, your omission of any allusion to the notorious part liver plays in love was a serious one tonight." "Your omission of any desire for close human sympathy in your life is a more serious one." "How can you be sure I have no such desire?" "I divine it. Your look, your manner tell me it is so. You were disagreeing with my sermon all the time I was preaching, weren't you?" "Part of the time." The servant changed the plates. He was a middle-aged, blonde, thin man with a stony white face, pale, prominent eyes, and an accomplished manner of service. When he had left the room, the professor continued. "Your remarks interested me, but I thought them exaggerated." "For instance?" "Let me play the egoist for a moment. I spend most of my time in hard work, very hard work. The results of this work, you will allow, benefit humanity." "Enormously," assented the father, thinking of more than one of Guildea's discoveries. "And the benefit conferred by this work, undertaken merely for its own sake, is just as great as if it were undertaken because I loved my fellow man, and sentimentally desired to see him more comfortable than he is at present. I'm as useful precisely in my present condition in my present non-affectional condition, as I should be if I were as full of gush as the sentimentalists who want to get murderers out of prison or to put a premium on tyranny, like Tolstoy, by preventing the punishment of tyrants. One may do great harm with affection, great good without it. Yes, that is true. Even le bon motif is not everything, I know. Still I contend that, given your powers, you would be far more useful in the world with sympathy, affection for your kind added to them, than as you are. I believe, even, that you would do still more splendid work." The professor poured himself out another glass of claret. "You noticed my butler?" he said. "I did." "He's a perfect servant. He makes me perfectly comfortable, yet he has no feeling of liking for me. I treat him civilly. I pay him well. But I never think about him or concern myself with him as a human being. I know nothing of his character, except what I read of it in his last master's letter. There are, you may say, no truly human relations between us. You would affirm that his work would be better done if I had made him personally like me as a man of any class, can like man of any other class. I should decidedly. I contend that he couldn't do his work better than he does it at present. But if any crisis occurred... What? Any crisis, change in your condition, if you needed his help, not only as a man and a butler, but as a man and a brother, he'd fail you then, probably. You would never get from your servant that finest service which can only be prompted by an honest affection. You have finished. Quite. Let us go upstairs, then. Yes, those are good prints. I picked them up in Birmingham when I was living there. This is my workroom. They came into a double room, lined entirely with books, and brilliantly, rather hardly, lit by electricity. The windows at one end looked on to the park, at the other on to the garden of a neighbouring house. The door by which they entered was concealed from the inner and smaller room by the jutting wall of the outer room, in which stood a huge writing table loaded with letters, pamphlets, and manuscripts. Between the two windows of the inner room was a cage, in which a large grey parrot was clambering, using both beak and claws to assist him in his slow and meditative peregrinations. "You have a pet," said the father, surprised. "I possess a parrot," the professor answered dryly. "I got him for a purpose when I was making a study of the imitative powers of birds, and I've never got rid of him. A cigar?" "Thank you." They sat down. Father Murchison glanced at the parrot. It had paused in its journey, and clinging to the bars of its cage was regarding them with attentive round eyes. He looked away from it to Guildea, who was smoking with his head thrown back, his sharp pointed chin, on which the small black beard bristled, upturned. He was moving his underlip up and down rapidly. This action caused the beard to stir and look peculiarly aggressive. The father suddenly chuckled softly. "Why's that?" cried Guildea, letting his chin drop down on his breast and looking at his guest sharply. "I was thinking it would have to be a crisis indeed that could make you cling to your butler's affection for assistance." Guildea smiled too. "You're right, it would. Here he comes." The man entered with coffee. He offered it gently and retired, like a shadow retreating on a wall. "Splendid, inhuman fellow," remarked Guildea. "I prefer the East End lad who does my errands in Bird Street," said the father. "I know all his worries. He knows some of mine. We are friends. He's more noisy than your man. He even breathes hard when he is specially solicitous. But he would do more for me than put the coals on my fire, or black my square-toed boots. Men are differently made. To me, the watchful eye of affection would be abominable. What about that bird?" The father pointed to the parrot. It had got up on its perch, and with one foot uplifted in an impressive, almost benedictory manner, was gazing steadily at the professor. "That's the watchful eye of imitation, with a mind at the back of it, desirous of reproducing the peculiarities of others. No, I thought your sermon tonight very fresh, very clever, but I have no wish for affection. Reasonable liking, of course, one desires." He tugged sharply at his beard, as if to warn himself against sentimentality. "But anything more would be most irksome, and would push me, I feel sure, towards cruelty. It would also hamper one's work." "I don't think so. The sort of work I do, I shall continue to benefit the world without loving it, and it will continue to accept the benefits without loving me." That's all as it should be." He drank his coffee. Then he added, rather aggressively, "I have neither time nor inclination for sentimentality." When Guildea let Father Murchison out, he followed the father onto the doorstep and stood there for a moment. The father glanced across the damp road into the park. "I see you've got a gate just opposite you," he said idly. "Yes, I often slip across for a stroll to clear my brain. Good night to you. Come again some day." "With pleasure. Good night." The priest strode away, leaving Guildea standing on the step. Father Murchison came many times again to number 100 Hyde Park Place. He had a feeling of liking for most men and women whom he knew, and of tenderness for all, whether he knew them or not. But he grew to have a special sentiment towards Guildea. Strangely enough, it was a sentiment of pity. He pitied this hard-working, eminently successful man of big brain and bold heart, who never seemed depressed, who never wanted assistance, who never complained of the twisted skein of life, or faltered in his progress along its way. The father pitied Guildea, in fact, because Guildea wanted so little. He had told him so, for the intercourse of the two men from the beginning had been singularly frank. One evening when they were talking together, the father happened to speak of one of the oddities of life, the fact that those who do not want things often get them, while those who seek them vehemently are disappointed in their search. "Then I ought to have affection poured upon me," said Guildea, smiling rather grimly, "for I hate it." "Perhaps some day you will." "I hope not, most sincerely." Father Murchison said nothing for a moment. He was drawing together the ends of the broad band round his cassock. When he spoke, he seemed to be answering someone. "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, that is my feeling. Pity." "For whom?" said the professor. Then suddenly he understood. He did not say that he understood, but Father Murchison felt and saw that it was quite unnecessary to answer his friend's question. So Guildea, strangely enough, found himself closely acquainted with a man, his opposite in all ways, who pitied him. The fact that he did not mind this, and scarcely ever thought about it, shows perhaps as clearly as anything could the peculiar indifference of his nature. One autumn evening, a year and a half after Father Murchison and the professor had first met, the father called in Hyde Park Place and inquired of the blonde and stony butler, his name was Pitting, whether his master was at home. "Yes, sir," replied Pitting. "Will you please come this way?" He moved noiselessly up the rather narrow stairs, followed by the father, tenderly opened the library door, and in his soft, cold voice announced, "Father Murchison." Guildea was sitting in an armchair before a small fire. His thin, long-fingered hands lay outstretched upon his knees. His head was sunk down on his chest. He appeared to be pondering deeply. Pitting very slightly raised his voice. "Father Murchison to see you, sir," he repeated. The professor jumped up rather suddenly and turned sharply round as the father came in. "Oh," he said, "it's you, is it? Glad to see you. Come to the fire." The father glanced at him and thought him looking unusually fatigued. "You don't look well tonight," the father said. "No? You must be working too hard. That lecture you're going to give in Paris is bothering you." "Not a bit. It's all arranged. I could deliver it to you at this moment verbatim." "Well, sit down." The father did so, and Guildea sank once more into his chair and stared hard into the fire without another word. He seemed to be thinking profoundly. His friend did not interrupt him, but quietly lit a pipe and began to smoke reflectively. The eyes of Guildea were fixed upon the fire. The father glanced about the room, at the walls of soberly bound books, at the crowded writing table, at the windows before which hung heavy dark blue curtains of old brocade, at the cage which stood between them. A green baize covering was thrown over it. The father wondered why. He had never seen Napoleon, so the parrot was named, covered up at night before. While he was looking at the baize, Guildea suddenly jerked up his head, and taking his hands from his knees and clasping them, said abruptly, "Do you think I'm an attractive man?" Father Murchison jumped. Such a question, coming from such a man, astounded him. "Bless me," he ejaculated. "What makes you ask? Do you mean attractive to the opposite sex?" "That's what I don't know," said the professor gloomily, and staring again into the fire. "That's what I don't know." The father grew more astonished. "Don't know?" he exclaimed, and he laid down his pipe. "Let's say, do you think I'm attractive? That there's anything about me which might draw a human being or an animal irresistibly to me, whether you desired it or not?" "Exactly. Or no, let us say definitely, if I did not desire it." Father Murchison pursed up his rather full, cherubic lips, and little wrinkles appeared about the corners of his blue eyes. "There might be, of course," he said, after a pause. "Human nature is weak, engagingly weak, Guildea, and you're inclined to flout it. I could understand a certain class of lady, the lion hunting, the intellectual lady, seeking you. Your reputation, your great name." Yes, Guildea interrupted, rather irritably. "I know all that, I know." He twisted his long hands together, bending the palms outwards till his thin, pointed fingers cracked. His forehead was wrinkled in a frown. "I imagine," he said. He stopped and coughed dryly, almost shrilly. "I imagine it would be very disagreeable to be liked, to be run after. That is the usual expression, isn't it? By anything one objected to." And now he half turned in his chair, crossed his legs one over the other, and looked at his guest with an unusual, almost piercing interrogation. "Anything?" said the father. Well, anyone. I imagine nothing could be more unpleasant." "Do you? No," answered the father. "But forgive me, Guildea, I cannot conceive you permitting such intrusion. You don't encourage adoration." Guildea nodded his head gloomily. "I don't," he said. "I don't. That's just it. That's the curious part of it, that I—" He broke off deliberately, got up and stretched. "I'll have a pipe too," he said. He went over to the mantelpiece, got his pipe, filled it, and lighted it. As he held the match to the tobacco, bending forward with an inquiring expression, his eyes fell upon the green baize that covered Napoleon's cage. He threw the match into the grate, and puffed at the pipe as he walked forward to the cage. When he reached it, he put out his hand, took hold of the baize, and began to pull it away. Then suddenly he pushed it back over the cage. "No," he said, as if to himself. "No." He returned rather hastily to the fire, and threw himself once more into his armchair. "You're wondering," he said to Father Murchison. "So am I. I don't know at all what to make of it. I'll just tell you the facts, and you must tell me what you think of them. The night before last, after a day of hard work, but no harder than usual, I went to the front door to get a breath of air. You know I often do that." "Yes, I found you on the doorstep when I first came here." "Just so. I didn't put on a hat or coat. I just stood on the step as I was. My mind, I remember, was still full of my work. It was rather a dark night. Not very dark. The hour was about 11 or a quarter past. I was staring at the park, and presently I found that my eyes were directed towards somebody who was sitting back to me on one of the benches. I saw the person, if it was a person, through the railings. "If it was a person," said the father. "What do you mean by that?" Wait a minute, I say that because it was too dark for me to know. I merely saw some blackish object on the bench, rising into view above the level of the back of the seat. I couldn't say it was a man, woman, or child, but something there was, and I found that I was looking at it. I understand. Gradually, I also found that my thoughts were becoming fixed upon this thing, or person. I began to wonder first what it was doing there, next what it was thinking, lastly what it was like. "Some poor creature without a home, I suppose," said the father. I said that to myself. Still, I was taken with an extraordinary interest about this object. So great an interest that I got my hat and crossed the road to go into the park. As you know, there's an entrance almost opposite to my house. Well, Murchison, I crossed the road, passed through the gate in the railings, went up to the seat, and found that there was nothing on it. "Were you looking at it as you walked?" "Part of the time, but I removed my eyes from it just as I passed through the gate because there was a row going on a little way off, and I turned for an instant in that direction. When I saw that the seat was vacant, I was seized by a most absurd sensation of disappointment, almost of anger. I stopped and looked about me to see if anything was moving away, but I could see nothing. It was a cold night, misty, and there were few people about. Feeling, as I say, foolishly and unnaturally disappointed, I retraced my steps to this house. When I got here, I discovered that during my short absence, I had left the hall door open. Half open. Rather imprudent in London. Yes, I had no idea, of course, that I had done so till I got back. However, I was only away 3 minutes or so. Yes, it was not likely that anybody had gone in. I suppose not. Was it? Why do you ask me that, Guildea? Well, well. Besides, if anybody had gone in on your return, you'd have caught him, surely. Guildea coughed again. The father, surprised, could not fail to recognize that he was nervous, and that his nervousness was affecting him physically. "I must have caught cold that night," he said, as if he had read his friend's thought and hastened to contradict it. Then he went on. "I entered the hall, or passage rather." He paused again. His uneasiness was becoming very apparent. "And did you catch somebody?" said the father. Guildea cleared his throat. "That's just it," he said. "Now we come to it. I'm not imaginative, as you know." "You certainly are not." "No, but hardly had I stepped into the passage before I felt certain that somebody had got into the house during my absence. I felt convinced of it. And not only that, I also felt convinced that the intruder was the very person I had dimly seen sitting upon the seat in the park. What do you say to that?" "I begin to think you are imaginative." It seemed to me that the person, the occupant of the seat, and I, had simultaneously formed the project of interviewing each other, had simultaneously set out to put that project into execution. I became so certain of this that I walked hastily upstairs into this room, expecting to find the visitor awaiting me. But there was no one. I then came down again and went into the dining room. No one. I was actually astonished. Isn't that odd? "Very," said the father, quite gravely. The professor's chill and gloomy manner, an uncomfortable, constrained appearance, kept away the humour that might well have lurked round the steps of such a discourse. "I went upstairs again," he continued, sat down and thought the matter over. I resolved to forget it, and took up a book. I might perhaps have been able to read, but suddenly I thought I noticed. He stopped abruptly. Father Murchison observed that he was staring towards the green baize that covered the parrot's cage. "But that's nothing," he said. "Enough that I couldn't read. I resolved to explore the house. You know how small it is, how easily one can go all over it. I went all over it. I went into every room without exception. To the servants, who were having supper, I made some excuse. They were surprised at my advent, no doubt." "And Pitting?" "Oh, he got up politely when I came in, stood while I was there, but never said a word. I muttered, 'Don't disturb yourselves,' or something of the sort, and came out. Murchison, I found nobody new in the house. Yet I returned to this room entirely convinced that somebody had entered while I was in the park." "And gone out again before you came back?" "No, had stayed, and was still in the house." "But my dear Guildea," began the father, now in great astonishment, "surely—" "I know what you want to say, what I should want to say in your place. Now do wait. I am also convinced that this visitor has not left the house, and is, at this moment, in it." He spoke with evident sincerity, with extreme gravity. Father Murchison looked him full in the face, and met his quick, keen eyes. "No," he said, as if in reply to an uttered question. "I'm perfectly sane, I assure you. The whole matter seems almost as incredible to me as it must to you. But as you know, I never quarrel with facts, however strange. I merely try to examine into them thoroughly. I have already consulted a doctor, and been pronounced in perfect bodily health." He paused, as if expecting the father to say something. "Go on, Guildea," he said. "You haven't finished." "No. I felt that night positive that somebody had entered the house, and remained in it. And my conviction grew. I went to bed as usual, and, contrary to my expectation, slept as well as I generally do, yet directly I woke up yesterday morning I knew that my household had been increased by one." "May I interrupt you for one moment? How did you know it?" "By my mental sensation. I can only say that I was perfectly conscious of a new presence within my house, close to me." "How very strange," said the father. "And you feel absolutely certain that you are not overworked? Your brain does not feel tired? Your head is quite clear?" "Quite. I was never better. When I came down to breakfast that morning I looked sharply into Pitting's face. He was as coldly placid and inexpressive as usual. It was evident to me that his mind was in no way distressed. After breakfast I sat down to work, all the time ceaselessly conscious of the fact of this intruder upon my privacy. Nevertheless, I laboured for several hours, waiting for any development that might occur to clear away the mysterious obscurity of this event. I lunched. About 2:30 I was obliged to go out to attend a lecture. I therefore took my coat and hat, opened my door, and stepped onto the pavement. I was instantly aware that I was no longer intruded upon, and this, although I was now in the street, surrounded by people. Consequently, I felt certain that the thing in my house must be thinking of me, perhaps even spying upon me. "Wait a moment," interrupted the father. "What was your sensation? Was it one of fear?" "Oh dear, no. I was entirely puzzled, as I am now, and keenly interested, but not in any way alarmed. I delivered my lecture with my usual ease, and returned home in the evening. On entering the house again, I was perfectly conscious that the intruder was still there. Last night I dined alone, and spent the hours after dinner in reading a scientific work in which I was deeply interested. While I read, however, I never for one moment lost the knowledge that some mind, very attentive to me, was within hail of mine. I will say more than this. The sensation constantly increased, and by the time I got up to go to bed, I had come to a very strange conclusion." "What? What was it?" "That whoever, or whatever, had entered my house during my short absence in the park was more than interested in me. More than interested in you. Was fond, or was becoming fond of me." "Oh!" exclaimed the father. Now I understand why you asked me just now whether I thought there was anything about you that might draw a human being or an animal irresistibly to you. Precisely. Since I came to this conclusion, Murchison, I will confess that my feeling of strong curiosity has become tinged with another feeling. Of fear? No, of dislike, of irritation. No, not fear. As Guildea repeated unnecessarily this asseveration, he looked again towards the parrot's cage. What is there to be afraid of in such a matter? He added. I'm not a child to tremble before bogies. In saying the last words, he raised his voice sharply. Then he walked quickly to the cage and, with an abrupt movement, pulled the baize covering from it. Napoleon was disclosed, apparently dozing upon his perch with his head held slightly on one side. As the light reached him, he moved, ruffled the feathers about his neck, blinked his eyes, and began slowly to sidle to and fro, thrusting his head forward and drawing it back with an air of complacent, though rather unmeaning energy. Guildea stood by the cage, looking at him closely, and indeed with an attention that was so intense as to be remarkable, almost unnatural. How absurd these birds are, he said at length, coming back to the fire. You have no more to tell me? Asked the father. No, I am still aware of the presence of something in my house. I am still conscious of its close attention to me. I am still irritated, seriously annoyed, I confess it, by that attention. You say you are aware of the presence of something at this moment? At this moment, yes. Do you mean in this room? With us? Now? I should say so. At any rate, quite near us. Again he glanced quickly, almost suspiciously, towards the cage of the parrot. The bird was sitting still on its perch now. Its head was bent down and cocked sideways, and it appeared to be listening attentively to something. That bird will have the intonations of my voice more correctly than ever by tomorrow morning, said the father, watching Guildea closely with his mild blue eyes. And it has always imitated me very cleverly. The professor started slightly. Yes, he said. Yes, no doubt. Well, what do you make of this affair? Nothing at all. It is absolutely inexplicable. I can speak quite frankly to you, I feel sure. Of course. That's why I have told you the whole thing. I think you must be overworked, overstrained without knowing it. And that the doctor was mistaken when he said I was all right. Yes. Guildea knocked his pipe out against the chimney-piece. It may be so, he said. I will not be so unreasonable as to deny the possibility, although I feel as well as I ever did in my life. What do you advise, then? A week of complete rest away from London, in good air. The usual prescription. I'll take it. I'll go tomorrow to Westgate and leave Napoleon to keep house in my absence. For some reason, which he could not explain to himself, the pleasure which Father Murchison felt in hearing the first part of his friend's final remark was lessened, was almost destroyed, by the last sentence. He walked towards the city that night, deep in thought, remembering and carefully considering the first interview he had had with Guildea in the latter's house 1.5 years before. On the following morning, Guildea left London. Father Murchison was so busy a man that he had little time for brooding over the affairs of others. During Guildea's week at sea, however, the father thought about him a great deal, with much wonder and some dismay. The dismay was soon banished, for the mild-eyed priest was quick to discern weakness in himself, quicker still to drive it forth as a most undesirable inmate of the soul. But the wonder remained. It was destined to be a crescendo. Guildea had left London on a Thursday. On a Thursday he returned, having previously sent a note to Father Murchison to mention that he was leaving Westgate at a certain time. When his train ran into Victoria Station at 5 o'clock in the evening, he was surprised to see the cloaked figure of his friend standing upon the grey platform, behind a line of porters. "What, Murchison?" he said. "You here? Have you seceded from your order that you are taking this holiday?" They shook hands. "No," said the father. "It happened that I had to be in this neighborhood today visiting a sick person, so I thought I would meet you." "And see if I was still a sick person, eh?" The professor glanced at him kindly, but with a dry little laugh. "Are you?" replied the father, gently, looking at him with interest. "No, I think not. You appear very well." The sea air had, in fact, put some brownish red into Guildea's always thin cheeks. His keen eyes were shining with life and energy, and he walked forward in his loose grey suit and fluttering overcoat, with a vigour that was noticeable, carrying easily in his left hand his well-filled Gladstone bag. The father felt completely reassured. "I never saw you look better," he said. "I never was better. Have you an hour to spare?" "2. Good. I'll send my bag up by cab, and we'll walk across the park to my house and have a cup of tea there. What do you say?" "I shall enjoy it." They walked out of the station yard, past the flower girls and newspaper sellers, towards Grosvenor Place. "And you have had a pleasant time," the father said. "Pleasant enough. Lonely. I left my companion behind me in the passage at number 100, you know. And you'll not find him there now, I feel sure." Ejaculated Guildea. "What a precious weakling you think me, Murchison." As he spoke, he strode forward more quickly, as if moved to emphasize his sensation of bodily vigour. "A weakling, no, but anyone who uses his brain as persistently as you do yours must require an occasional holiday. And I required one very badly, eh?" "You required one, I believe." "Well, I've had it, and now we'll see." The evening was closing in rapidly. They crossed the road at Hyde Park Corner and entered the park, in which were a number of people going home from work, men in corduroy trousers caked with dried mud. "Until the evening," murmured Father Murchison to himself. "What?" asked Guildea. "I was only quoting the last words of the text, which seems written upon life, especially upon the life of pleasure. 'Man goeth forth to his work, and to his labour.' Those fellows are not half bad fellows to have in an audience. There were a lot of them at the lecture I gave when I first met you, I remember. One of them tried to heckle me. He had a red beard. Chaps with red beards are always hecklers. I laid him low on that occasion. Well, Murchison, and now we're going to see." "What?" "Whether my companion has departed. Tell me, do you feel any expectation of again thinking something is there?" "How carefully you choose language." "No, I merely wonder." "You have no apprehension?" "Not a scrap, but I confess to feeling curious." "Then the sea air hasn't taught you to recognize that the whole thing came from overstrain?" "No," said Guildea, very dryly. He walked on in silence for a minute. Then he added, "You thought it would?" "I certainly thought it might. Make me realize that I had a sickly, morbid, rotten imagination, eh? Come now, Murchison, why not say frankly that you packed me off to Westgate to get rid of what you considered an acute form of hysteria?" The father was quite unmoved by this attack. "Come now, Guildea," he retorted. "What did you expect me to think? I saw no indication of hysteria in you. I never have. One would suppose you the last man likely to have such a malady. But which is more natural, for me to believe in your hysteria, or in the truth of such a story as you told me? You have me there. No, I mustn't complain. Well, there's no hysteria about me now, at any rate. And no stranger in your house, I hope." Father Murchison spoke the last words with earnest gravity, dropping the half-bantering tone which they had both assumed. "You take the matter very seriously, I believe," said Guildea, also speaking more gravely. "How else can I take it? You wouldn't have me laugh at it when you tell it me seriously." "No. If we find my visitor still in the house, I may even call upon you to exorcise it. But first I must do one thing, and that is, prove to you as well as to myself that it is still there." "That might be difficult," said the father, considerably surprised by Guildea's matter-of-fact tone. I don't know. If it has remained in my house, I think I can find a means, and I shall not be at all surprised if it is still there, despite the Westgate air." In saying the last words, the Professor relapsed into his former tone of dry chaff. The father could not quite make up his mind whether Guildea was feeling unusually grave or unusually gay. As the two men drew near to Hyde Park Place, their conversation died away, and they walked forward silently in the gathering darkness. "Here we are," said Guildea at last. He thrust his key into the door, opened it, and let Father Murchison into the passage, following him closely and banging the door. "Here we are," he repeated in a louder voice. The electric light was turned on in anticipation of his arrival. He stood still and looked round. "We'll have some tea at once," he said. "Ah, Pitting." The pale butler, who had heard the door bang, moved gently forward from the top of the stairs that led to the kitchen, greeted his master respectfully, took his coat and Father Murchison's cloak, and hung them on 2 pegs against the wall. "All's right, Pitting? All's as usual?" said Guildea. "Quite so, sir." "Bring us up some tea to the library." "Yes, sir." Pitting retreated. Guildea waited till he had disappeared, then opened the dining-room door, put his head into the room, and kept it there for a moment, standing perfectly still. Presently he drew back into the passage, shut the door, and said, "Let's go upstairs." Father Murchison looked at him inquiringly, but made no remark. They ascended the stairs and came into the library. Guildea glanced rather sharply round. The fire was burning on the hearth. The blue curtains were drawn. The bright gleam of the strong electric light fell on the long rows of books on the writing table, very orderly in consequence of Guildea's holiday, and on the uncovered cage of the parrot. Guildea went up to the cage. Napoleon was sitting humped up on his perch with his feathers ruffled. His long toes, which looked as if they were covered with crocodile skin, clung to the bar. His round and blinking eyes were filmy, like old eyes. Guildea stared at the bird very hard, and then clucked with his tongue against his teeth. Napoleon shook himself, lifted one foot, extended his toes, sidled along the perch to the bars nearest to the Professor, and thrust his head against them. Guildea scratched it with his forefinger 2 or 3 times, still gazing attentively at the parrot. Then he returned to the fire, just as Pitting entered with the tea tray. Father Murchison was already sitting in an armchair on one side of the fire. Guildea took another chair and began to pour out tea, as Pitting left the room, closing the door gently behind him. The father sipped his tea, found it hot, and set the cup down on a little table at his side. "You're fond of that parrot, aren't you?" he asked his friend. "Not particularly. It's interesting to study sometimes. The parrot mind and nature are peculiar." "How long have you had him?" "About 4 years. I nearly got rid of him just before I made your acquaintance. I'm very glad now I kept him." "Are you? Why is that?" "I shall probably tell you in a day or 2. The father took his cup again. He did not press Guildea for an immediate explanation, but when they had both finished their tea, he said, "Well, has the sea air had the desired effect?" "No," said Guildea. The father brushed some crumbs from the front of his cassock and sat up, higher in his chair. "Your visitor is still here?" he asked, and his blue eyes became almost ungentle and piercing as he gazed at his friend. "Yes," answered Guildea calmly. "How do you know it? When did you know it? When you looked into the dining room just now?" "No, not until I came into this room. It welcomed me here." "Welcomed you? In what way?" simply by being here, by making me feel that it is here, as I might feel that a man was if I came into the room when it was dark. He spoke quietly, with perfect composure, in his usual dry manner. "Very well," the father said. "I shall not try to contend against your sensation, or to explain it away. Naturally, I am in amazement. So am I. Never has anything in my life surprised me so much. Murchison, of course I cannot expect you to believe more than that I honestly suppose. Imagine, if you like, that there is some intruder here. Of what kind, I am totally unaware. I cannot expect you to believe that there really is anything. If you were in my place, I in yours, I should certainly consider you the victim of some nervous delusion. I could not do otherwise, but... Wait, don't condemn me as a hysteria patient, or as a madman. For 2 or 3 days, I feel convinced that, unless I am indeed unwell, a mental invalid, which I don't think is possible, I shall be able very shortly to give you some proof. There is a newcomer in my house." "You don't tell me what kind of proof." "Not yet. Things must go a little farther first. But perhaps even tomorrow I may be able to explain myself more fully. In the meanwhile, I'll say this, that if eventually I can't bring any kind of proof that I am not dreaming, I'll let you take me to any doctor you like, and I'll resolutely try to adopt your present view, that I'm suffering from an absurd delusion. That is your view, of course." Father Murchison was silent for a moment. Then he said, rather doubtfully, "It ought to be." "But it isn't?" asked Guildea, surprised. "Well, you know, your manner is enormously convincing. Still, of course, I doubt. How can I do otherwise? The whole thing must be fancy." The father spoke as if he were trying to recoil from a mental position he was being forced to take up. "It must be fancy," he repeated. "I'll convince you by more than my manner, or I'll not try to convince you at all," said Guildea. When they parted that evening, he said, "I'll write to you in a day or 2, probably. I think the proof I am going to give you has been accumulating during my absence, but I shall soon know." Father Murchison was extremely puzzled as he sat on the top of the omnibus, going homeward. You have been listening to How Love Came to Professor Guildea by Robert Hichens. The story will be concluded in Part 2.